This media studies academic, currently working in Italy, spoke to us via Skype.
Within the BBC, decision-making needs to be devolved. And what this means, in my view, is that we need Devo Max for the BBC. We need a federal BBC. BBC Scotland should have control of all the licence fee money which is raised in Scotland, and also full control over the schedules and the programmes so that it can choose when to opt in to UK BBC programming rather than opt out.
Currently, revenues from the licence fee run to 3.6 billion UK-wide. Pro rata, that would mean a Scottish slice of around 325 million, although undoubtedly there would be a lot of horse trading on the figure. Would this be a good way of Scotland keeping up with the network while having more control and identity?
If you go back to 1998, when the then BBC governors rejected the idea of the Scottish Six, what they said at that time was the BBC needed to be in step with devolution. In my judgment, the BBC has fallen behind devolution, and now the opportunity has arisen, obviously with a referendum coming as well, to prepare for a BBC post the referendum decision, whichever way it goes. But my view would be that even were Scotland independent, it might be good to keep the BBC, but in a federal structure.
That's not what the Scottish Government wants. After independence, it would scrap Auntie and replace it with a Scottish Broadcasting Corporation. Favourites like Strictly Come Dancing and EastEnders would stay, but with more Scottish content replacing other existing BBC shows. The Scottish Government's Culture Secretary says the problem is there's no Scottish input into the licence fee negotiation.
The problem with that is Scotland has no control over that whatsoever. And I think it's important, if we're going to maintain standards, and we maintain that in an independent Scotland with an independent broadcaster based on the staff and the assets from BBC Scotland, that we have to maintain the best of that. And that means putting a moratorium on the jobs cuts that are currently planned in news and current affairs. So we're perfectly capable of having a strong broadcasting base. I think the question has to be asked is, what kind of future is there for the BBC under the Union and the Conservative government when they've done what they've done over the last few years that's caused the cuts? And who knows what they'll do with the renegotiation of the Charter in 2016.
Labour, the Tories and Lib Dems voted in Parliament in favour of a Scottish digital channel to run alongside our current offering. But all want to see broadcasting stay as a reserved issue.
And running line B. The circumstances of his departure make it hard to justify.
This is the gallery where Newsnight Scotland and a whole raft of other programmes are produced. The BBC is undoubtedly in crisis, but despite the criticisms of navel-gazing and over-examination of itself, this could be a good chance for us to examine the direction of travel for broadcasting in Scotland in the future.
I think the BBC has a track record over decades of being very successful. It weathers crisis after crisis every so often, and it will come through this crisis. One of the problems looking ahead is that there's going to be a UK general election in 2015 if the UK still exists, and the BBC Charter is due for review or renewal 2015-2016. The great danger for the BBC is that the politicians get too involved in it, and that's why I'm appealing to the BBC Trust and BBC management to prepare for a more federal BBC, whether independence comes or not.
This store may be at Newsnight and the wider BBC in London, but broadcasting in Scotland may still have to endure the winds of change.
Well, I'm joined now by the Media Policy Professor, David Hutchison of Glasgow Caledonian University, from Dundee by the blogger and broadcaster Leslie Riddick, and from Edinburgh by Professor Lindsay Patterson, who resigned from the BBC Council when the broadcaster dropped its plans for a Scottish Six bulletin. Thanks all for joining us. Leslie Riddick, let me start with you. There are clearly big changes afoot at the BBC to try to restore trust and a sense of direction. Leaving aside systems and structures for a moment, how important is the choice of Director General in that process?
Well, it is hugely important. I mean, sometimes I suppose people can think that's just one person, and what leadership can one person, particularly one London-situated person, give? And yet I can remember the fallout from 2003 after the Iraq War, when Greg Dyke was forced to walk the plank. He was a very dynamic, down-to-earth, working-class sounding guy who kind of offset the perception sometimes that the BBC is a very sort of Oxbridge-dominated type of medium. And he motivated staff. The BBC, I think, under him was on the front foot. And since then, there's been, I think, a fear that has extended right across the BBC from London to Scotland about pushing the boundaries, about taking risks, about trying to take on difficult political issues, and in a sense living within self-prescribed limits, which have resulted in sometimes nicey programming, whereby what's happening on Twitter or YouTube or a lot of the parallel social media is actually feistier and involves a greater range of people. Now that's what the BBC and BBC Scotland could be working to get back. And the way you've tackled this tonight actually is a breath of fresh air. Okay. And it feels like you've been reinvigorated by the challenge that's emanating from down south. And we need more of this.
There is a challenge, isn't there, David Hutchison, because the timing of this crisis could not be worse in many ways. We're looking ahead to a referendum on independence in 2014. BBC Scotland, for one part of the organisation, has a great focus and a lot to do.
Yes, it has, and we're in a situation where the newspapers, particularly the broadsheet newspapers, but the tabloids as well, are suffering quite catastrophic declines in circulation. So in the run-up to the actual referendum in the next 2 years, the broadcasters, STV as well as the BBC, of course, are going to be very important. And what I think concerns me about what has happened is that the BBC brand, if you like, has been contaminated. There's going to be terrific pressure on this broadcaster and an STV in the next couple of years. You have two groups of people who are arguing about the future of the country, and if the going gets rough, there is a chance of accusations being made about poor journalism, shoddy standards, and what has happened recently could be brought in evidence, and that would be very regrettable, but I fear it might happen.
And in the meantime, Lord Patten of the BBC is saying that whoever gets appointed as Director General, whether they've got great skills or not, they'll be pressed to devolve power away from senior managers in London. What do you think he means by that?
Yeah, I looked again at that clip and wondered exactly what he did mean. I think he means something about how the BBC in London is managed. I don't really think he was concerned about what was going on in Cardiff or Belfast or in Glasgow. I think it's to do with internal management. I mean, frankly, I think there's a terrible danger that we now totally restructure the BBC, because basically what has happened is there have been some very serious journalistic failures and some failures at the top, but the whole organisation hasn't imploded, and you know there is a need for a sense of proportion here when it gets to restructuring.
Lindsay Patterson, when you heard Lord Patten talking about devolving power within the BBC, is that something that was attractive to you? After all, you resigned from the Broadcasting Council for Scotland in protest at the decision not to establish a Scottish Six.
Well, yeah, I think David Hutchison's right there. I don't think that was probably at the forefront of Lord Patten's mind when he was saying that. I suspect their focus is really very obsessively right at the moment of what's going on in London. But I do agree, though, that there is a much wider opportunity here. I mean, it does seem to me, actually, that looking back over the 15 years since that controversy in the late 1990s, that what we have predicted would come to pass has come to pass. We've seen an increasingly parochial news agenda in most outlets on BBC Scotland, I have to say, Newsnight being a distinguished exception. We have seen an increasing ignoring of Scottish and indeed Welsh and Northern Irish stories by network news, so-called network news in London. And as a result, in fact, rather ironically, the opposition to the Scottish Six, which was taken on unionist grounds, seems to me to be actually making this union less united as far as news is concerned, and it's almost impossible to have a proper democratic dialogue across these islands about the future of the Constitution.
The difficulty is, of course, the Scottish Six is an idea whose time perhaps has passed, bearing in mind that we've got lots of different kinds of programmes these days, different platforms and the like.
Yes.
Is there an obvious solution to the problems that you've pointed out there?
Well, clearly there are many more technical options now than there were 15 years ago, and certainly a digital channel doing for television what Radio Scotland does for radio would indeed be a much more viable option than it was then. So that's exciting and a real possibility for the future. But it still is nevertheless the case that nearly 500,000 people, for example, watch Reporting Scotland. Let me give you an example from last week, last Wednesday, the day after President Obama was re-elected. Now, there's been a very surprising and sudden upsurge in US interest in the forthcoming referendum in Scotland. What we were desperate in need of on Wednesday night was an informed discussion from Washington about what the implications were of that election result for the future of Scotland and US involvement in that. What we got was some murders in football. That was parochialism at its worst.
Leslie Riddoch, from your perspective, is there a case now for what we heard Robert Beveridge calling for in that report, a federal BBC, a Devo Max BBC, as it were?
Well, there is, and you would think somehow that the kind of shift towards Salford meant something more than simply a kind of shift of location, that it symbolised something, but I suspect it probably doesn't. Still within Scotland, though, I think Lindsay's absolutely right there. The challenge is to be having such riveting analysis of the reality of our own world and the worldview from Scotland. That's what the BBC is being paid a licence fee for, because just doing good enough is actually now being done on other platforms. I mean, back in the day when we might have been discussing this before, and the Scottish Six, there wasn't the alternative distribution mechanisms that now exist. So there are many worlds. You know, there's a world, even as we're broadcasting now, there are people watching comments on Twitter about this. Twitter was a huge part of the whole difficulty with Newsnight. In a sense, it might even have prompted it. Jeremy Paxman made his views known via his agent on Twitter. Many people will have first read Ken McCrory's report, details today on Twitter. If the BBC is being given extra cash to do something extra, then it has to bring so much more to the game. It has to make this a sparkling, radiant, vital conversation with diversity that reflects the whole of Scotland and the best of us. Otherwise, then you begin to wonder why. Why is there a kind of reserved and protected amount of cash going to the BBC when everybody else is having difficulties doing that serious journalism?
David Hutchison, one of the issues, of course, with any notion of a federal BBC is who retains control. Where does the power lie? The unionist parties particularly have looked at this, and they presumably take the view that you can't really have a sort of autonomous BBC in Scotland unless you have a sort of independence set up.
Well, the Germans managed to run a federal structure of broadcasting and produce some pretty good programmes. I mean, I think there's a genuine issue that has to be looked at by those who argue for more devolution, and I think I'm one of them. The issue is how much power has got to stay in the centre if the centre is able to defend itself against its enemies, of which there are quite a few to be seen at the moment. I don't think you can have a completely federal BBC, frankly. I think there could be far more devolution of power, provided people face up honestly to the financial questions. I mean, one of the fascinating things about the debate about the digital channel is just about every MSP, I think, in Holyrood voted for it. Did they offer a few million towards the cost, the 75 million cost? Not a halfpenny was forthcoming. So I think there's a need to be honest about the actual costs of a greatly enhanced BBC operation in Scotland. And just before I lose the point, I mean, I accept what my colleagues have said about some of the parochialism. There's some damn good broadcasting in Radio Scotland. For example, the what used to be called Newsweek Scotland on a Saturday morning, it's now an edition of Good Morning Scotland, internationally oriented, rather good.
Lindsay Patterson, look ahead for us 5 years. There's a lot of politics in the way. What would you like the media landscape to look like from Scotland?
Gosh, that depends on the outcome of the referendum, doesn't it? But I do think, let's suppose, for example, on the one hand, that the referendum votes in favour of independence, then clearly an independent country would be entitled to have its own broadcasting corporation. So then the challenge is, as your clip said, Robert Beveridge said, do they negotiate some sort of confederal arrangement with the BBC in London, which for the reasons that David Hutchison just gave there, I think would be highly desirable. Some excellent stuff comes from London which we need to retain access to. Let's suppose, on the other hand, that the referendum votes against independence. In a sense, that poses a bigger challenge, in fact, because clearly, according to what all the non-SNP parties have said, there will be greater autonomy for Scotland. So at some point it will presumably become urgently necessary to have a news agenda that is actually in some ways set from Scotland. David is right there to say that there is good stuff being done, but not nearly enough.
There we must leave it. I'm sorry, we are out of time. Thank you all very much indeed. Lindsay Patterson, Leslie Riddoch, David Hutchison, thank you all.